Hey guys! Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to get settled. Find the position your body wants to relax in most. Release any areas that feel tight. Let your shoulders drop naturally, slowly letting go of the fatigue you've carried all day. Tonight, we will spend a whole day in a quiet monastery in ancient France, from the cold darkness before dawn until the last candle burns out deep in the night. There is no plot here that asks you to stay tense or alert. The story moves gently with the rhythm of your breath, just to tenderly guide you to sleep. If these tranquil journeys help you find rest, you are warmly welcome to follow this channel, so that another night like this can arrive whenever you need it. Gently tap like, or leave a little message below telling us where you are listening tonight. This also helps more people discover these stories. There is no rush to do these things. They can wait until tomorrow morning or remain untouched forever. Right now, none of these ask anything from you. Only warmth surrounds you at this moment, the night slowly settling, and a long, gentle story waits quietly to begin. If your eyelids feel heavy, just let them close. Slow your breathing down. When you are ready, we will step into a cold stone corridor just before the darkness ends and the first bell of the day rings. This monastery is a bit apart from the village, with a low wall at the edge of the fields and a gate that is latched every night. This is northern France in the 13th century, deep into early winter, the long night outlasting the candlelight. I want to take you there, not a distant observer on the road, but standing with me inside the high walls, silent before the dawn. The first thing you will notice is the cold. It seeps through the stone floor and your thin-soled cloth shoes, settling in the long corridors where the air has never truly warmed. The air carries the smell of animal fats and cold ashes, the scent of damp wool drying somewhere, and the aroma of bread soon to be baked but not yet in the oven. In one corner, a solitary lamp burns quietly, faint but steady. Beyond that, everything is vague outlines and deep shadows. The women who live here have given their years completely to one religious order. Some arrived as children, never having seen the world beyond these four walls. Some came later, carrying sadness or freedom behind them, choosing this quiet on purpose. And some, let's not fool ourselves, were placed here because they had nowhere else to go. No matter how they came together, their daily life is the same, steady as the years go by. Standing here, what I want you to feel is just how orderly one day is divided in this place. Nothing here is left to chance. There are fixed times to rise, fixed times to chant, fixed times to work, and fixed times to eat in silence, accompanied only by a clear voice reading aloud. There are nuns who ring the bells, nuns who manage the bread, nuns who care for the library, and nuns who tend the sick. Each of them holds a thread of this house, weaving together the monastery's unchanging daily life. I sense a kind of peace in this, even for those of us watching from outside the gates. Our ordinary days rush in all at once, demanding everything from us in a split second. Here, the day is announced by the bells, 1 hour following another at a calm pace. When 1 hour ends, it is gently put down before you smoothly pick up the next. You don't have to carry all the burdens yourself, you just need to go where you're called when the bell rings. Imagine you are standing there now, in the dim corridor, feeling the cool stone, accompanied by the faint flicker of a lone lamp. Above you, near the ceiling, a thick rope hangs beside the great bell. A nun has already awakened, quietly counting time in the darkness, waiting for the moment to pull the rope. You do not yet know which rooms this day will pass through. You only know it is about to begin, just as calmly as it has on 10,000 mornings before. In a moment the bell rope will tighten, and the first bell of the day will break through the cold air. Let us wait quietly together for its arrival. Before dawn, someone was already awake. She lay in the dark for a while, quietly listening. The dormitory around her was filled with the faint sounds made by sleeping women, the rustling of straw bedding, a soft cough, and the wind sweeping over the roof. As the rule required, she slept in a close-fitting shirt and never took it off, even at night. She was covered with a long robe and a sheepskin, and during this cold season, a cloak was also spread over the bed to keep warm. She didn't need to light a candle to know the time. She had woken up in this same darkness too many times before, Her body remembered the time for her. Tonight, like most nights, she woke up a little earlier than the appointed time. She was a sacred vessel guardian nun. In this monastery she was called Sister Sybil. Among all the nuns, her duty was to keep track of time. More precisely, not the years and months, but the hours of the day. The monastery's schedule was marked by bell ringing, and ringing the bell was her job. In a way, the daily routines, prayers and chants of everyone here depended on the hands that pulled that bell rope. Let's get closer to her in the dark and see how such a day begins. She got up earlier than everyone else. Her bare feet touched the freezing cold ground, and she groped her way to put on simple cloth shoes, which hardly offered any warmth on the stone floor. At the end of the dormitory hung a single lone lamp. Its flame was low but steady. She walked toward it like she was heading to a small fire on a winter road. In the faint light, at first she was just a silhouette, a darker shadow moving among the beds. Then she stepped into the corridor, where the light stretched her shadow long against the wall, and she moved toward the stairs, disappearing from sight. I always thought there was something tender in this. Under a roof full of women who devoted themselves to God, the first to wake each day was not the loudest voice in prayer, nor the one in charge of everything, but the one responsible for ringing the bell. All that would happen this day was still quietly waiting within this small first task. Chanting, baking bread, long labours, silent lunches, slowly moving toward another night. Until she counted through the dark and judged the time had come, none of it could begin. The hallway she walked through can be felt before you see it. The cold seeps through your shoe soles, climbing up to your knees and hands. The air carries the scent of cold stone, the smell of animal fat hardened in oil lamps, and that faint sweetness from old incense that never fully leaves the church. In the light, you can barely make out the white breath she exhales. Somewhere ahead in the darkness she's moving toward hangs the bell rope. She finally arrived before it, standing beneath the cold space holding the great bell. The bell rope hung from very high above, that wooden frame from which the heavy bell was suspended. The end of the rope was smoothed soft by years of hands touching it. She grasped it. For a moment, she simply stood there, feeling the weight of that huge object above, slowing her breath. Then she pulled the bell rope. The first bell sound today cut through the crisp air. It was not a harsh sound. A well-rung bell is gentle, accompanied by a slow and steady swing. Those tones echoed through the monastery's dim rooms, passed along the corridor, reached the dormitories, and fell on the ears of those still asleep. This sound established all order. For the women lying on cold beds, the meaning of this bell was the same as long ago. The long night is over, it is time to rise and sing. If you have ever been awakened at the deepest moment of a winter morning, you understand the unique struggle, how the body begs for just a little more warmth. Now imagine you are right there, between the beds, hearing that bell sound cut through the floor. There is no choice here, so in a strange way no struggle either. The bell has already made the decision for you. You pull back the cloak, put your feet on the floor and stand in the cold dark to begin dressing. Just like the woman beside your bed is dressing. Just like the women who came before you did. All of you silently repeat the same movements. The clothes are simple. Every woman here wears nearly identical attire. They wear black woolen robes, no other colours, as black is the colour of repentance and suits this life best. The robes reach the heels, but never longer, to avoid picking up dust. Across their heads lies a white headband covered with a veil, made not of silk but rough cloth. Those who have shaved heads might wear a small sheepskin hat for warmth. In the dark they dress almost by feel, their fingers tracing the familiar fabric. When fully dressed to an outsider, you look just like any of the other women rising together in the room. This brings comfort too, to be one shadow among many, no longer just yourself, but one of the nuns answering the bell's call. As people in the dorm quietly got up, Sister Sybil had already gone ahead into the church to prepare. This was the other half of her duty, the half no one else saw. She took care of the chapel and everything in it. She tended the oil lamps burning before the altar, refilling and trimming the wicks so their weak flames wouldn't die out overnight. She guarded the sacred vessels, the chalice and the paten were cleaned and neatly arranged. She watched over the monastery's holy relics and incense. With one or two other nuns, she made communion wafers from pure wheat flour, no impurities added, baking them on a hot iron plate days before use. I imagine her moving alone through the dim church, lighting lamps that needed lighting, straightening out objects that had slipped askew, and I find this to be a quiet and patient devotion. She was not the centre of anything, she simply prepared the place where others would soon stand. When the nuns came downstairs, the candles were already lit and the altar ready. None of them thought about who had arranged it. That was the meaning of this work. It was meant to disappear in the light of day. She had another task that, from our perspective, might be the strangest of all her responsibilities. She had to know exactly what day it was, not just which date, but on a deeper level. The monastery's year consisted of a great cycle of feast days, fast days and saints' commemorations, and determining their dates followed a set of calculations that were not always simple. Some feast days were fixed each year, which was easy enough, but others were movable, tied to the phases of the moon and the long weeks that followed. To find out exactly when they fell, the sacred vessel guardian nun needed enough knowledge to calculate, to study the calendar, and figure out which morning corresponded to which day. When she rang the bell in the dark, she was not just announcing the hour. In a way, she was also announcing that particular day had arrived. Whether a feast or an ordinary day, it had its own prayers and colours, distinct from every other day in the flowing year. To me, this is a detail worth pausing over. Before the day could be lived through, it had to be named. The women coming downstairs didn't have to worry about such knowledge. One of them had already done the calculations. The rest just had to rise and sing, trusting that the day they woke up to had been counted and placed rightly in its appointed place. Now they filed down the stairs through the night, entering the church where Sister Sybil's lit candles burned. Outside it was still pitch dark. The windows were black, the only light the warm, flickering flames. As the women came in one after another and found their places, the light revealed their breaths. They stood in 2 rows, facing each other across the cold stone floor. In this brief moment, accompanied by the last few footsteps and soft coughs, everything fell into stillness. They began to sing slowly. The first office of the day was sung in Latin during the deep night. Long hymns echoed back and forth between the 2 rows of the choir. One row finished a verse, the other responded, and the words slowly travelled back and forth through the dim space, endlessly looping. Their rhythm was older than any woman standing here. The sound was not trained to be pleasant. It was simply the voices of these women, year after year, singing the same words every night until those words grew as smooth as the end of the bell rope, until they no longer had to think to find them. If you stood among them, you might not understand every word, but you could catch its shapes and rises. The sound patiently moved from one side to the other. After a while, you wouldn't feel so cold. In this small stone space, many voices gathered to create a warmth unrelated to fire. Above you, the candles burned steadily. Outside the black windows, the night sat deep. In this world, except for standing here and singing these lines reaching you, waiting to sing the next, you had nowhere else to go. The office was not short. It moved one hymn after another through readings and responses, with no rush or hurry. Nothing after could not wait until this was done. This might be the hardest thing to bring back from that church into our own mornings. The day had yet to demand anything practical from these women. Before baking bread, combing wool, or caring for the sick nuns, there was only this, an hour to softly voice old words in the dark. The practical part of the day would come. It was not first. The first to come was this singing, this candlelight, and the cold held carefully at the edges of the room. When the office finally ended, the voices faded away. After so much sound, the silence that remained felt vast. The women stood quietly for a moment. If you stepped outside and looked, you might see the first faint grey light creeping along the horizon, the tiniest loosening of the dark. Or maybe the night was still thick. It hardly mattered. Whether it was light or not, the day had begun. Beginning with one woman waking alone, a rope, a bell, and those long familiar words sung in the cold. After completing her first task, Sister Sybil slowly walked away, blew out candles no longer needed, and kept the rest burning. Deep in her mind, she had already begun thinking of the next bell ringing, the moment it must sound. The faint dawn began to cast a greyish-white glow along the narrow window frame, and a nun was already busy in the monastery storeroom, a large bunch of keys hanging from her waist. Her name was Sister Matilda, the head of the monastery's kitchen. If the nuns who guarded the sacred vessels kept the monastery's time, then Matilda was in charge of its hunger. Year after year, day after day, feeding the entire monastery, every nun, every servant, was the long, hard task resting on her shoulders alone. It was a never-ending job with no holidays. No matter what the spirit desired, the body always needed food to nourish it. Most mornings she started her day in the cellar and storerooms, and that is where we find her now. The underground air was cool and silent, mixed with various scents. The smell of grain in the granary, the sharp dryness of salt, apples laid on straw, and the faint sourness rising from malt beer barrels in the dark. Carrying a small lantern, she walked along the rows of shelves, calculating silently. She was always quietly calculating. How much grain was left, carefully planning to make it last several weeks, how many salted fish remained, enough to get through the coming long fasting period, whether the cheese was well preserved, how long the lamp oil would last, and if there was enough beeswax for the upcoming festival candles. I had not seen her yet, but already felt respect for this woman who carried keys and silently calculated. To the eye, a barrel of salted fish seemed hardly sacred, but the entire monastery's operation depended on her getting these small accounts right. If she miscounted the supplies in autumn, a week of hunger would hit in spring. She silently bore this responsibility all on her own. The monastery's rule was very clear on one thing, and that one thing teaches you a lot. Among everyone, the head of the kitchen faced the greatest temptation because she held the keys to all the good things. For that very reason, she was held to the strictest discipline and could never pilfer secretly. She was never allowed to sneak a fine pastry or richer food to enjoy alone. The ancient rule harshly equated such a sin with the most unforgivable betrayals, like the one who dipped with the Lord in the same dish. It sounds heavy for just a bite of food, but I think you understand the wisdom behind it. The one who holds all the keys must be the one who takes the least. Her integrity was the cornerstone supporting the entire monastery. So let us follow her out of the cool dark cellar and into the grey dawn of the monastery courtyard. Her care did not stop at the storeroom threshold. Her responsibilities extended throughout every corner of this small monastic world. You might not imagine the monastery as a farm, but in many ways that is exactly what it was. The noble goal here was to keep the women cut off from the world, and one way to do that was to make the monastery as self-sufficient as possible. Inside the high walls, or just outside not far beyond, you would find almost everything needed for a self-sustaining settlement. There were grain mills, a flour-sifting house to separate fine flour from coarse bran, huge ovens for baking bread, vegetable gardens, orchards, beehives, fish ponds, poultry yards with chickens and geese, and fields for livestock. The simple idea written in ancient rules was that the monastery's land should produce all that was needed to sustain life here, so the nuns would have as little reason as possible to send someone out or to step themselves into the noisy world beyond. Matilda patrolled this little kingdom like a careful steward surveying an estate. At the mill, she might pause to check how the grain was grinding. Massive millstones turned while white dust floated in the air, settling everywhere. On the miller's arms, on the beams, and on her own black sleeves. It was a warm, dry scent with a slight sweetness, the smell of grain being crushed. From here, the flour was sent to the sifting house to be sorted by coarseness, then onto the ovens where the day's bread was kneaded into shape and put to bake. Soon the smell of baking would fill that corner of the courtyard and rise to everyone's nose inside, silently telling them the day was moving toward mealtime. The kitchen itself was a busy little world, with Matilda as its leader. She did not need to do every task herself. She had servants and lay sisters who handled the heavy, rough labour. Much of her skill was managing them well, assigning tasks, keeping harmony. They maintained the roaring fires, keeping them at the right temperature. They hung big, heavy pots over the flames, slow-cooking thick soups made from grains, beans and vegetables, a humble daily diet for this place. They fetched water, chopped wood, and endlessly scrubbed boards and bowls. Standing in that kitchen on a cold morning was standing in the only warm room in the building, filled with steam, smoke, and whispered talk among workers. Matilda's job was to make sure that after all this daily labour, when the bell rang to call the meal, the food was ready, never too early to get cold, never too late so everyone would be starving and waiting. There was also the dairy, which had its own heavy workload under her control. The monastery's cow and sheep milk could not be kept fresh long, so it had to be processed into stored products. Butter had to be churned, a slow, exhausting task hard on the arms. Cheese had to be pressed, placed on shelves to mature, then regularly turned, wiped, and cared for over weeks until fully ripened. The dairy had a cool, clean, and unique smell, a mix of milk, damp cloth, and old wood. A nun who worked there long could judge how good the cheese was just by its look and weight in her hand. The essence of this head kitchen manager's skill was not any single busy morning, but her deep foresight ahead of the seasons. In a way, a monastery like this lived by the year and had to plan its livelihood for all 12 months. Autumn was the season of stockpiling supplies and the busiest, most anxious time of her tenure. Animals that would not survive winter or had no feed were slaughtered, the meat tightly packed and heavily salted into barrels to preserve through the cold months without fresh food. Fruit from the orchard was picked, laid on straw, dried, or turned into jam with saved honey. Grain was stored carefully in the granaries to last through the long stretch until the next summer's harvest. In all these decisions, Matilda had to act like a prophet, estimating how much food would be needed from now until the green shoots appeared next spring. Store too little, and everyone would go hungry. Store too much, and waste and rot would follow. This was an account calculated months ahead, and only when winter was nearly over and fresh food scarce would she know if her estimates were correct. If you accompanied her to the garden on a morning gentler than today, you would see the other half of the storeroom, that rich half of the food. You would see the herb beds, root vegetables, and leafy greens tended year-round, cabbage, leeks, and beans laid out to dry. You would see the orchard where apples and pears once filled the cellar straw. You would see the low-humming beehives. Honey was the only sweetener inside the monastery. Sugar was rare and costly, so honey was the substitute. The beeswax harvested with the honey would be made into candles to light the church. You would see hens and geese busy around the grain stacks and the fish pond raised for fasting days when no meat was allowed. The head of the kitchen had to consider all this carefully, planning ahead, adding it all to that endless silent ledger of what the monastery had and still needed. Behind it all was a real ledger filled with the numbers. Whatever was bought or sold, the head kitchen manager had to keep track and be accountable. Using farm output, land rent from monastery estates, or the modest funds allotted to her, she purchased things the land could not produce. When their own grain supply ran low, they bought grain. Salt had to be continually bought. It preserved all the meat and fish for the whole year. Spices and preserved fruits were bought in small amounts for feasts. Large amounts of fish were bought for the long fasting period when meat was forbidden. Fish was the most important and expensive ingredient of the year. If the monastery's rules allowed, some wine or malt beer was bought. These were common drinks of the age, not the indulgent beverages we think of now. In all these dealings, the head kitchen manager was the only point of contact between this closed monastery and the outside world. The monastery farms often produced more than the nuns could eat. Surplus grain, wool or bumper crops were sold, and the income from the monastery's land rents was recorded in money or goods. The nuns themselves could not join market crowds. Most trades happened at the wall's edge, handled by a trusted servant or agent who dealt with merchants and cart drivers, bringing needed goods back in. The world came to the gate, did its business, and turned away. Its numbers, prices, debts, and the slow turning of goods into money and money into goods all entered the head kitchen manager's ledger. So even inside this house built to shut the world out, there had to be a woman to settle the world's accounts. In this region, that drink was usually malt beer. Brewing malt beer was itself a craft requiring slow care, done inside the high walls like everything else. Grain was soaked to sprout, then dried and ground, before being soaked in hot water until the sweetness leached into the liquid. This liquid was left to ferment in wooden barrels, kept cool and dark, finally becoming a light beer. It was a safe, mild drink for all ages, something to drink every day to quench thirst. It was not strong or meant for revelry. It was simply a daily thirst quencher. And having a monastery that brewed its own beer meant one less reason to send anyone out to buy drinks. Even eating was governed by rules that ran through the entire week. Some days allowed meat, maybe 3 in a week, but certainly not during Lent, when the kitchen only had fish, beans and bread. If wine was allowed, it was limited, not for free drinking. Nothing was ever casual, or for the satisfaction of appetite alone. The head kitchen manager had to know all these rules well, and prepare ahead to ensure enough fish on fasting days and meat on meat days. The right food had to come at the right time, and those seated at the table never had to think about where it came from. Watching her, I suddenly realised that such a life, already turned away from the world, demanded so many worldly skills. Running the mill, famine kitchen and brewery, buying and selling, balancing accounts, managing servants and meeting the needs of a house full of women. When we imagine a praying nun, none of these talents come to mind. Yet these were her daily realities. A good head kitchen manager had to be patient, shrewd and fair. She was not just a nun, but a manager. The monastery did not free its women from worldly burdens. It just gathered those burdens inside the walls, shared them out and gave most to her. By now, the daylight had fully brightened, the grey-white light spreading evenly over the gardens and rooftops. Somewhere an oven was already hot, and the smell of bread began to drift in the cold air. In the kitchen, pots were already on the fire, morning meals prepared, and the long tables in the refectory waiting for dishes to be set. Mathilde stood in the middle of it all for a moment, keys at her waist, thinking over what still needed doing before the noon bell. There were always endless tasks, but the stores had been counted, the dough was rising, and at least for today this monastery would eat well and be safely fed. Inside this monastery there is a room almost completely immersed in silence and the smell of ink. When the morning light is bright, some nuns come here. It is a long room, just a corner of a larger chamber, placed where the windows can catch even the faintest pale winter daylight. Along the walls are slanted desks like little roofs. The nuns sit at them, leaning over their work, each one lost in her own small patch of cool grey-white light. It is almost completely silent here. Only the soft scratch of pen tips on paper can be heard, the dry, crisp rustle of pages turning. Occasionally, a sigh, or the creaking of a stool as someone shifts slightly to ease a stiff back. This is the quietest work in the monastery, and also the work most likely to be remembered for centuries. What is created in this room may still be read long after the women who made it are forgotten. The woman in charge of this room, and also of the choir, is Sister Constance. Her position is a curious dual role. She is the lead singing nun, the choir's instructor, who knows all the sacred music of the monastery. Her job is to train others in their chanting, to lead them through the long cycles of daily prayers, and to teach all the hymns to the younger nuns whose voices are still forming. At the same time, she manages the books. She is the librarian, responsible for lending and retrieving books, aware of where each volume is kept and how it is preserved. She guards the choir's voices like precious painted pages. More than that, if the abbess falls ill, or cannot manage affairs, Sister Constance stands in for her. Music, books, and governing the monastery in the abbess's absence. All these heavy responsibilities rest on one pair of shoulders. As I quietly reflect on this combination of music and books, I find it a wonderful arrangement. The chanting that rises in the church and then fades away, leaving nothing behind but memory, and the pages that firmly fix the words on paper for centuries to endure. Both are watched over by the same woman. She tends both the fleeting sounds and the eternal written word. Perhaps only she in this entire monastery truly feels how deeply connected they are. One is the breath of long prayers, the other the body of that prayer. Music alone is enough to be a heavy burden for any woman. The chants in the daily offices are not something you learn once and remember forever. There are many hymns, canticles and responsories, each with its own unique melodic turns, each tied to a specific feast or season. All of this must be firmly ingrained in the choir's memory, because there were hardly any written scores to rely on. Much was passed down by ear and long habit. Knowing all this and teaching it became Constance's responsibility. She drills the young voices over and over on each passage until it sounds flawless. She corrects those who go off pitch, guides the choir's two sides to stay in sync so the sound is unified, smooth and harmonious rather than a scattered mess. A well-sung choir does not come about by accident. Behind the seamless flowing songs that fill the church every day are countless quiet hours of patient teaching, all from her hands. Now let us turn to the work going on in this room, the actual copying. Unless you've seen it, it's hard to imagine how exhausting this labour is. In this age, a book is entirely handmade, page by page, word by word. There are no two identical books in the world because each one is the product of someone's patient hands working many days or weeks, and for a large volume, sometimes many months or even years. Before the nun sitting at the desk lies blank pages ready to be written. The book she is copying sits where she can clearly see it. She writes on parchment, treated animal skin that has been scraped clean, smoothed and cut to size. Even this writing surface is itself the product of long labour before the first word falls. Her ink is kept in a small cornered jar or ink pot. Her pen is a quill, a feather shaft cut and shaped into a fine point that wears down and must be sharpened again and again. She starts by ruling faint lines on the page as guides to keep the writing straight. Then she copies word by word, line by line, constantly comparing to the source text while transferring each phrase onto the new page. It's worth pausing a moment to consider how much work lies behind these simple tools. Almost nothing here is bought, ready-made. The parchment itself comes from animal hides soaked, scraped of hair and flesh, stretched on wooden frames to dry, then rubbed and polished until the surface can absorb ink without bleeding or soaking through. It is a slow and unpleasant process, and a single book might consume the skins of an entire flock before it is finished. The ink is made by the nuns themselves, typically from oak galls, iron salts and gum, boiled and strained until it turns jet black and lasts on the page. The pens are feathers, most often from geese, cut, split and sharpened with a small sharp knife that never leaves the scribe's hand because the nib dulls quickly and must be redone repeatedly throughout the morning. Even the faint lines that hold the text straight are drawn by hand before a single letter is written. So before copying can even begin, a great deal of humble, meticulous preparation has already happened, mostly inside these high walls. The work is extremely slow and physically draining. Backs bent, eyes straining in dim light to discern letters, hands clutching the pen, often cramping. In the cold of winter, fingers grow stiff and clumsy, and the ink thickens, becoming hard to use. A scribe might copy only a few pages a day, and every line demands intense focus. A single missed or wrong word is a mistake that will be passed on to every copy made from her manuscript in the future. There is a humility to this work that words fail to express. Giving an entire morning or a whole week to faithfully transferring someone else's words from one page to another, adding nothing of your own, seeking no glory, just pure accuracy. One thing has always moved me deeply. In this long, patience-demanding age, we seldom know the names of those who do this work. 'Cause scribes rarely signed their pieces. They finished copying, set down their pens, and let the works carry their unmarked legacy into the world. Among the few known names, some are women. In rooms like this, women bent over desks creating books that preserve knowledge. Most of them are now nameless to us, but the works made by their hands outlasted their lives by an entire generation. Some pages contain not only text but also careful decoration, another great art of this room. At the start of new chapters, a huge initial letter might be painted, far larger than other letters and covered in colourful designs. Here the paints in small pots come into play, blues, reds, greens and gold. Not just paint, but actual gold leaf, a thin sheet applied and burnished until it glows like a shining little window on the page. A gifted nun pours long hours into a single letter, filling it with intricate vines, leaves and patterns, so that when a reader's eye falls on that page, before reading a word she is deeply drawn in. At its most basic, this is a practical task, making a book to be read and used. Yet the care put into it makes it something beyond the book itself, a devotion, a thing created beautiful for its own sake and for the words it bears. Imagine sitting at one of these desks in the cool grey-white light, holding a fine brush tracing a red line along the curve of a giant initial. Silence fills the room. The morning stretches out with no need to go anywhere. Just this letter, then the next, slowly filling the page with colour over many patient hours. Outside, the world goes on without you and demands nothing. Many of these monasteries also have a school. At certain times, girls are gathered for lessons, and they are not all there to become nuns. Some come from families who want their daughters educated but have nowhere else to send them. They stay for a term or several years, learning what the monastery can teach. Young girls start with letters, tracing their shapes, then learn to read. The brightest continue with Latin, spending every day studying the same words chanted by the older nuns, until the language in the books becomes their own. Girls from noble families may get more careful instruction than those from poor homes, but this education matters for all of them. For many, those years behind the high walls are their only schooling. If you stand at the edge of that little school and watch a child stumble through her first few lines of Latin, in an age when hardly any women outside knew how to read, you realise that something quietly remarkable is happening in this plainest room. When a book is finally finished, it is more than just those dozens of pages. The written and painted sheets are gathered and sewn together, bound between wooden boards, usually covered in leather, and sometimes fitted with clasps to keep it closed. A book left open will quickly be damaged. Bound books can survive for centuries, passing from hand to hand long after the makers have died. These handmade books are the true priceless treasures of the monastery, and keeping them safe is Constance's task. Their cost is almost unimaginable. Each is the fruit of months of work and expensive materials. A monastery might own only a few books, which are guarded carefully, lent out then returned for reading, always watched for moisture, damage, or careless handling, slowly wearing them away. Lending a book is serious business. Losing or destroying one is a real loss, hard to replace. No matter how small the library, it is a silent wealth. The nun in charge holds not gold but the words forged by minds and prayers from those who came before. Sometimes books are borrowed from other monasteries to copy, and their own books lent out the same way. Knowledge flows along these long walls, slowly passing from one monastery to another, enriching each with the neighbours' collections. There is another reason all this matters, one that goes beyond any single monastery's walls. In this age, monasteries were often the only places where women could get an education. Outside these walls, schooling was almost entirely reserved for men, and many girls might grow up illiterate. Inside these walls, girls were taught. They learned to read, and many also studied Latin, the language of books and prayer. Some of the most learned women who grew up here are remembered by name even now, like Hrotsvith, a Saxon nun from earlier times who wrote dramas and chronicles inside such walls. For most women, no names remain, but the knowledge is real, preserved and passed on here, in rooms like this, at desks like these. Now the light outside has shifted, and soon the bell somewhere in the monastery will call the nuns away from their desks to the next round of daily prayers. Pens are cleaned and set down, ink pots covered, unfinished pages left for tomorrow. Because the words will not go anywhere, and with the pace allowed this day, there is no need to rush. Sister Constance moves through the room, checking everyone's work, whether a page is neat, a letter finely painted. She seldom speaks, and rarely is there much to say. A morning's work is done, and the books have grown by several more pages. In a monastery like this, that is enough. In another part of the monastery, there was a room humming with activity, doing a different kind of work. Compared to the silence at the copying desks, this place moved at a slower, warmer pace, with the air thick with the scent of sheep. The first thing you noticed was that smell, the strong, greasy, living smell of raw wool. It was stored in baskets, piled in corners, and even clung to the clothes of the working women. Here stood the weaving looms, large wooden frames stretched tight with threads. The nuns sat, stood, or leaned before the looms, throwing shuttles and pulling combs. The room echoed with soft, rhythmic clicks and thuds, punctuated by the lighter hum of spinning wheels turning. After the deep quiet of the church and scriptorium, you realise that hands here never rested. The labour itself composed its own music. The nun in charge was called Yolanda. Her title sounded simple, but her responsibilities were among the broadest in the whole monastery. All the monastery's clothing was her domain. Every robe on someone's back, every veil, every piece of underwear, every bedsheet, every cloth on a table. It all fell under her care. Of course, she did not spin every single thread herself. She coordinated everything from the wool on the sheep's backs to the folded, finished robes. She assigned tasks, decided who spun the yarn and who did the sewing, distributed needles and scissors, then collected them afterward. In that time, even a single needle was a precious item that could not be lost. I gradually came to see that, in the plainest and most vital sense, she was the person who kept the monastery decent and warm. Mending torn hems or worn bedsheets didn't sound noble. No one wrote saintly biographies about darning stockings. But a room full of women needed clothes. Worn clothes had to be patched and replaced year after year. Someone had to oversee it, plan ahead, and make sure that when a robe finally wore out, another was ready. That person was Yolanda. Her work was like that of the housekeeper for meals or the guardian of sacred vessels, only noticed when it was not done right. Let's follow the wool's journey, which was long and full of hard labour in this room. It began on the backs of the monastery's own sheep. The first task was shearing, the once-a-year cutting of the wool, heavy, greasy, creamy white, falling in clumps. This raw wool had to be cleaned, dirt and most grease washed out. Then it was teased and combed, pulled repeatedly through the comb teeth until the tangled clumps opened up into soft, even fluff like clouds, with all fibres aligned in one direction, ready to be spun. This combing was a patient, hand-driven task, a huge workload. Even enough wool to make the clothes for a single nun for a year required a staggering amount. Like many things in the monastery, wool processing followed the seasons. The big yearly shearing happened in the warm months. The whole flock's wool cut at once, quickly filling the room with more raw wool than could be handled fast. The monastery had to rely on this harvest to provide the cloth for the whole next year. So in the following months, combing, spinning and weaving went on steadily every day, gradually turning summer's wool into robes and blankets to withstand winter. A wise clothing manager always kept this long rhythm in mind. Her work was never just about the day at hand, but about the coming seasons. Next came spinning, where you could see the oldest image of female labour. A nun took the combed wool and drew it out with a spindle, twisting it into a long, even thread. The spindle spun, dropped, rose. The yarn grew steadily from her fingertips. Once learned, this skill required little thought, so it was often used to fill quiet moments or pass idle time. It was the go-to task when women sat needing something to do with their hands. The spun thread was used for weaving cloth, slowly woven on the loom, warp and weft crossing, row by row, until a length of simple wool fabric was complete. The black robes worn around the monastery were cut from this fabric. Aside from wool, they also wove linen, a lighter, closer to skin cloth, and many household linens were made this way. All these fabrics, long or short, began as plants growing in fields and ended as wearable clothes through these patient hands. Before the finished cloth could be used, it went through several more steps. Fresh from the loom, the new fabric was loose and sparse and needed fulling, being squeezed and beaten in water until the fibres locked tightly, turning the cloth thick, strong and warm. Then came dyeing. The monastery's robes were black, but that colour was not natural. The fabric had to be dyed, dipped in large vats filled with deep dark dye, until it took the sombre tone dictated by the order. A colour of confession and mourning that made these women stand apart wherever they went. Pulling the heavy soaking fabric in and out of the dye vats was hot, hard, and stained the hands black up to the wrists for days after. Without this step, no robes would exist. It was another quiet labour woven into the making of the monastery's plain clothes. In such a monastery, there was always needlework to do, never ending. Picture a winter afternoon sitting with them, cold fingers holding a needle, a torn robe on your lap. Once fabric was ready, it needed cutting and sewing, and then later mending, as elbows and knees wore thin, hems frayed, seams split. Household linens too, tablecloths and napkins, sheets and covers, all having to be washed, patched or replaced in turn. This was not finish then put away work. It was like the daily office, rhythmic and repeating. By fading light, a bending nun mended. Her work yesterdays and tomorrows endless. I believe there was a strange peace in this labour. It occupied hands but freed the spirit. It had no grand victories or end, just quiet satisfaction in closing tears and restoring usefulness. Before mending came washing, itself a hard task and one of the most exhausting in the monastery. All linen and clothing had to be cleaned, and in that time washing was no easy matter. No shortcuts. Water had to be drawn and heated, fabric soaked, beaten, rubbed, wrung by hand. Arms grew sore, fingers raw and red from cold. Sheets, tablecloths, napkins, robes, all had to be cleaned in turn, then spread out or hung. Drying into grey, damp winters could take days. Clean clothes steamed quietly by the hearth or hung on lines wherever there was room. It was heavy, wet, cold work, mainly done by lay sisters, servants, and young nuns. Like everything else, laundry was relentless. A whole room full of women created a steady tide of dirty clothes that had to be fought off week after week. Beds and dormitories also fell under Yolanda's care. Mattresses, long pillows, blankets, and all sleep-related items had to be aired, flipped, kept in good condition. Also under her charge were the novice nuns not yet fully pledged, who before their formal acceptance were assigned to her. Beyond managing wool, linen, and bedding, she bore responsibility for these young lives, assigning them tasks and teaching them this room's work, protecting them through those unstable years before becoming full nuns. Much of the hard labour was done by their young hands, learning the ropes and joining this way of life. Her hands touched not just fabric, but leather as well. Leather arrived and was stored for making and mending shoes, since even shoes wore through soles. An isolated monastery still had to keep its nuns from walking barefoot on the cold stone floors. The simple shoes were made and repaired like everything else, leather cut and worked into footwear. This was another humble craft done within the monastery walls, part of its self-sufficiency and minimising outside contact. I want to save the greatest thing for last. In such a monastery, needlework was not all humble. It was from rooms like this that some of the era's most beautiful crafts emerged. Alongside plain cloth and endless mending, the nuns were known for exquisite embroidery and the huge tapestries and hangings they created. Works so skillful they were prized even beyond the walls. A tapestry could be so large a single piece covered a whole church wall, woven with months or years of care, figures overlapping, colours blending, telling full sacred stories in silk thread. These were treasures of the time, hanging in grand churches as gifts between powerful people, valued like our finest paintings today. Most of these elaborate works were made for the church itself, often decorating the monastery's own altars or chapels before ever leaving the walls. There were altar cloths, warm hangings marking seasonal changes for the cold little chapels, and liturgical embroidered vestments worn during services. All were stitched with very fine silk thread and bright colours, often trimmed with gold thread. This was the only place in the plain black monastery allowed any show of splendour. A gifted nun would spend long hours at the embroidery frame, fabric stretched tight before her, building patterns stitch by stitch. A leaf, a flower, a figure slowly formed as carefully chosen wool and silk threads were sewn. A huge tapestry was no single woman's work, but the result of many women's shared effort over years, returning day after day to the frame, the image growing so slowly you could barely see it change from one afternoon to the next, until one day it was complete in a way that seemed both impossible and natural. This work was so famous that the most renowned piece, a long embroidered tapestry recounting the Norman conquest of England, was traditionally credited to the nuns' embroidery needles, said to have been made for Bishop Odo of Bayeux under the guidance of Queen Matilda. Whether the legend was true or not, it shows us how valued these women's work was. A masterpiece holding the history of conquest, naturally assumed to have come from their hands, the very same fingers that patched worn robe hems on a grey afternoon might one day be stitching tiny perfect stitches outlining a king, his ships, and his battles, turning it into a work that would last longer than any kingdom on a painted scroll. I think this close mix of humility and glory is one of the most moving things about this room. There is no clear line between them. The wool was still wool, the needle still a needle, the patient's bent back still a back. Whether the task was darning torn socks or embroidering a grand tapestry fit for a cathedral. The skill making the first was the same that created the second. Maybe this is the truest lesson this room can teach us. No matter the size of the task, when done with steady, calm focus and care, it creates a value that stands the test of time. Afternoon slowly passed and the light in the room began to dim. The clicks of the looms slowed. A nun set down her spindle and stretched stiff fingers. Yolanda moved among baskets of wool and half-finished cloth, gathering embroidery needles, counting scissors, tidying the room to welcome tomorrow. Tomorrow it would all start again, shearing, combing, spinning, weaving, and endless mending. In this slow, unending cycle turning wool into warmth, the women of the monastery could dress properly and withstand the cold. When the noon bell chimes, it calls everyone in the convent to do one of the few things that every nun must do together at the same time and in the same room. It calls them to eat. They gather from their busy spots throughout the morning, from behind desks, beside looms, in the kitchen, and in the vegetable garden, to the refectory, that long dining hall. The tables are set and the simple food for the day is ready. First they wash their hands, then they pray, and finally they take their seats on the benches. A hush descends on the room. They come together not to talk. In such a convent, meals are eaten in silence. Picture this scene. A whole room full of women eating together, but not saying a word. You can hear the crisp clinking of spoons against bowls, the soft pouring of a bit of malt wine, the scraping sound of benches as they shift. But no chatter, no casual talk, no noise you often find around a dining table. Instead, from a raised platform at one end of the hall, comes a single voice reading aloud. A nun assigned to this task reads scriptures, the life of a saint or other sacred passages while the others eat. This way, as their bodies are nourished, so too is their spirit. The food is eaten in silence. The reading echoes overhead, and together they turn their meal almost into a liturgical hour, another orderly moment in the day. But this silence doesn't mean the nuns don't communicate at the table. If a nun needs salt, wants another piece of bread, or some more drink, she cannot ask out loud. Convents like this one keep a small, quiet system of signals that everyone understands. Through gestures, a nun can ask another for what she needs without speaking. A finger motion means bread, another gesture means water, and the message travels along the bench, met with the corresponding response. Imagine how wonderful this is. A whole language of tiny moves growing within silence, so that even the most ordinary act of eating doesn't break the quiet. The nun who reads aloud only takes this role in turns. It rotates so no one has to do it all the time. She reads while others eat and waits to eat herself until they finish. Reading aloud is a service she gives before being served. Standing day after day reading to a hall full of silent eating women is itself a small kind of discipline. Like everything here, the task is shared and passed on. No single duty ever burdens one pair of shoulders forever. The food itself is plain but carries a deep fairness. On days when meat is allowed, it appears. During long fasts, meat disappears, replaced by fish, beans, or thick soups made from grains and vegetables, and always enough bread. But what really illustrates the point is this. In a well-run convent, those in charge do not eat better than anyone else. Though the abbess holds a high position, she cannot have finer dishes set before her. She does not get her own special table, nor sweeter treats. She eats the same food as the youngest, lowest-ranking nun at the same table. The rules on this are clear. Leaders must live the same life as their flock so that they truly understand their needs. There is no elevated table of luxury, no noble seat piled with delicacies while others make do with plain fare. They all eat the same food in silence, listening to the same voice, reading aloud. These rules about food also reflect a sort of wisdom and even kindness that goes beyond what we might imagine from this austere way of life. The women who ran these convents once asked themselves, since women's bodies tend to be weaker than men's, should nuns really fast as strictly as men did? Should they sometimes be allowed a bit of wine because their bodies might need it? These were not frivolous questions. They came from a genuine care for the women living this life, from the recognition that these rules existed for them, not the other way around. If a discipline meant to purify the body ended up destroying it, then it defeated its own purpose. While fasting was harsh, it was not without measure. Hidden in the simple food served was quiet attention to how much these particular women's bodies could endure. There is also a small kind of politeness in the way meals are shared. When two nuns eat from the same plate, etiquette required each to pass the better pieces to her companion, rather than grabbing the tastiest portions. They must not take overly large or scalding pieces to avoid choking. And before drinking water, they wipe their mouths to keep the cup clean for the next person. These are tiny rules, almost homely, and they form the peaceful principles for daily communal dining. In a convent that follows these rules, the dining table never becomes a place of scuffling and competition. One small habit about bread has always stayed with me, quietly revealing how this whole world holds itself together. Leftover crumbs of bread after a meal must never be casually discarded by diners. They belong to the poor and are set aside to be given out as alms at the door to those who are hungry. The nuns are gently but firmly warned never to waste the poor's bread as some families might, using leftovers to wipe hands or knives. The rule forbids dirtying the poor's bread just to save washing a cloth or tablecloth. Think about that care. Even the crumbs on the table have their place, already promised to a hungrier person, and the convenience of the nun must not come at the expense of that bread meant for the poor. The entire order of this place shrinks down into this rule about leftover bread. There is only one time when the peaceful silence around the table shifts, and that is when guests visit. Hospitality is a duty of the convent. Guests sit among the nuns and may be honoured with special dishes prepared for them. But even then, humility remains. The abbess herself, despite her rank, serves the guests at the table, serving them instead of being served. Once the guests finish, she eats with the servants. It is an astonishing role reversal, a leader standing to serve a stranger, waiting to eat until the stranger is finished. It shows how leadership here is understood. Leadership is not a privilege to be served, but an obligation to serve. When the meal is finished and the after-meal prayers are said, silence breaks or perhaps eases. Quiet is the convent's normal state. Noise is the exception. There is a little break in the middle of the day where one can stroll in the cloisters, or handle small personal matters until the bell calls them again for prayer or sends them back to work. The afternoon unfolds ahead, grey and brief in this season, and the convent settles into the long hours ahead. Now, let's follow one nun to a different room, a place quieter and warmer than anywhere we have yet seen. Every one of these convents must have a room reserved for the sick. This is the infirmary run by Sister Beatrix. Her role might be the gentlest and also the heaviest of all. When others' bodies weaken, they are entrusted to her. Patients come here, those brought down by fever or common ailments of the time, and the elderly, those who have grown too frail over the years to rise for night prayers or sit at the loom, ending up in Beatrix's care to spend their final seasons of life. It is a separate room, warmer than the rest. Here, those who can no longer keep the convent's harsh pace find a small measure of gentle comfort. To do this work well, Beatrix must have some medical knowledge, which itself is worth pausing over. In a time when women rarely had any education at all, this nun had to learn at least a bit of medicine. She had to stock the herbs the convent could provide and care for the sick with her own hands. Most of what she knew was simple medicine of the age: which herb eased, which ailment, which potion reduced fever, which poultice calmed swelling or heat. Though modest, this was often the only help patients would get, and in her hands it was real care filled with patience. Much of her medicine came from the convent garden, herbs not grown for the table but for healing. Some plants, leaves, roots and flowers would be dried, soaked and crushed into remedies. They were picked in season and stored for use when needed. Step into the infirmary and you smell all this. Hanging bundles of herbs and stored roots giving off dry, woody scents mixed with clean linen, and the small stove's warmth that burns continuously to comfort patients. Beatrix knows these plants as well as the cook knows her stores or the keeper of wool knows her supplies. Through long familiarity, this knowledge lives in her hands. One treatment from that era also fell to her: bloodletting, which was the common medical practice to treat many diseases. It was thought to balance the body and drain harmful substances. When needed, an experienced nun would perform it. The fact that women here handled this treatment is itself a notable detail. It avoided the need for outside male doctors to enter the cloister. The convent's enclosure meant the women had to care for their own, even in this regard, so the skill was kept and passed down between nurses, another ability preserved by these high walls. The work was done quietly and efficiently. Once the patient was settled and comfortable again, the gentle attention moved on to the next care task. The infirmary was also the only place where the strict food rules of the table could be quietly set aside. The ill could not live on fasting meals alone. They were allowed eating what others could not: meat during fasting seasons to regain strength, richer, more nutritious food, and any nourishment weak bodies needed to recover. People understood that disciplines meant to strengthen will only harm patients. The care shown by strict management of the communal table also knew when to show mercy. Within the convent's strict life, the infirmary was a small island guarded by gentler care. The heart of the infirmary was not its medicine, but its tenderness. Most of what Beatrix did was not medical treatment, but simple care. Bringing broth and warm malt wine, changing bed linens, lighting fires for warmth, sitting through hard nights beside sick nuns, and with patient, quiet attention making illness more bearable. For those old and near the end, their long lives spent inside these walls, maybe 50 or 60 years, they would pass away under Beatrix's care. A girl might enter the convent and only leave it in death. This is a life hard for us to imagine, but it was the fate of many here, and at life's close this room and this nun's care, the steady chime of the familiar bell through the walls, ensured that even those about to leave were not excluded from the convent's rhythm but carried by it to the very end. Afternoon light, the last bit left, filters softly grey and pale through the small windows. A fire crackles quietly in the corner stove. An old nun sleeps, breathing slow. Beatrix moves quietly between beds, straightening a blanket here, placing a cup within reach there, doing the patient, humble, unnoticed work of kindness that never ends and asks for no recognition. Outside, the convent carries on with its usual orderly bustle. In the warmth and quiet of the infirmary, days flow to the slowest, gentlest rhythm, keeping time to the pace of the sick and the old. The brief daylight began to fade, and as the light outside the window shifted from grey-white to a deeper dark grey, the bell once again summoned the entire convent together. The nuns returned from their various tasks, greeting the arrival of evening with chants. As nightfall approached, the candles were rekindled. The women formed 2 rows again, standing face to face across the cold church floor, passing psalms back and forth between each other. The same room, the same voices, the same ancient words that filled the space before dawn, slowly circling once more, but with a completely different feeling now. The morning chants reached out toward the day yet to start. The evening chants gathered up the nearly finished day, gently setting it down. There was a kind of fatigue in the sound, but not unpleasant, rather the honest tiredness of a day's work completed. The candlelight seemed softer, and the dark moving outside the window was the dimness of coming rest, not the twilight before awakening. In some place among them stood the woman who commanded it all. It was time to meet her. In every room we passed, her presence was felt even though we never actually saw her. She was the Mother Superior, called Madame Adelaide within this convent. Her rank was the highest in the convent, the whole burden of the place ultimately resting on her shoulders. Within these high walls, her authority was nearly absolute. The ancient rules likened her to a general commanding an army. Everyone must obey her. This comparison was not strange, because she alone was responsible for everything that happened here. She carried a staff as a symbol of her status, that kind of crozier held by bishops, and within her own convent's boundaries her power was likened to that of a bishop. She was the head here, embodying all of the convent's authority. Her power came in 2 forms, which is why the position was so weighty. First, she was responsible for the convent's religious life, maintaining the rules, overseeing the nuns' discipline and souls. Equally real was her charge over the convent's secular life, the bread, the roof, and the coins. The convent owned land, which brought in income, and she was the one overseeing it all. She had to make sure the convent was supplied, manage its assets, keep everything sufficient. She was both a spiritual mother and the administrative head of an estate. As long as she held office, these 2 burdens pressed day after day on the shoulders of the same person. If you stop and think carefully, this secular power carried a strange quality. The convent could own land like any lord and enjoy all the rights and duties that came with it. And the Mother Superior stood at the top of these assets, collecting income and fulfilling responsibilities. Yet she was confined within the walls. She could not personally go out into the world to handle matters, could not ride into court, to market, or to inspect her lands. The ancient rules used a plain metaphor. Just like a fish dies if it stays out of water too long, a person who has dedicated body and soul to religion will lose the life they vowed to lead if they mix too much with the secular world. The Mother Superior managed her estate from within the cloister, giving orders and dealing with the outside world through trusted agents and servants who came and went beyond the walls. She wielded real power over lands she might rarely or never have seen. It was a strange picture, a woman with immense authority ruling an estate she could never enter, her influence reaching miles beyond a threshold she herself would never cross. In a well-run convent, she was not a distant power imposed on others. Usually, she was chosen by the nuns themselves, elected from among them, personally put into power by the women who would then be governed by her. Deep thought was given in the rules about who should be chosen. She had to be sufficiently learned to read and to understand scripture and the order's regulations. She had to be dignified, able to earn respect and obedience, not through force, but by the strength of her character. I found one point especially striking. The rules plainly warned against choosing someone simply because they were great or rich, especially if they came from noble birth. They said that unless there was no alternative and pressing reason, noble-born women should not be made Mother Superior, as they were often vain, proud, and placed too much value on their titles. What was valued was character, not lineage. The convent must never be handed over to a woman just because the outside world would bow before her. Once elected, she was bound by extremely strict rules of humility, just like any nun, perhaps even more strictly, and constantly watched. She could never live more comfortably or leisurely than the women she ruled. She was not allowed a private dining room or sleeping chamber, could not sleep on a softer bed or eat finer food. She had to share everything with her flock, eat what they ate, sleep where they slept. This way she could understand their lives from within and never grow distant from the daily burdens she asked them to bear. The rules were very harsh on this point. The leader must place self-restraint above all so as not to lead others astray by example. The higher the rank, the less personal privilege was allowed. There was a cold wisdom in this. True authority does not mean claiming more freedom, but accepting the fewest privileges and showing everyone that you take the least. In this all-female convent, there was one thing, perhaps the only thing, that none of the women could fill themselves. They could manage, teach, heal, chant prayers day after day, even run the whole estate, but they could not be priests. They could not or celebrate Mass. For this one thing, a priest had to come from outside, a clergyman specially assigned to perform the ceremonies for them. Thus, even the most cloistered women's convent maintained this single direct connection to the greater church. This one gap in their self-sufficiency was notable because it made everything else stand out even more. In nearly all other respects, these women needed no one. They handled their own eating, clothing, care, teaching and management. This was a complete world run by women within high walls. Only before the altar did that closed world open just enough to omit the one role they could not fill themselves. She was not a dictator, and she did not act on personal whim. For lesser matters, she could decide on her own, but on major issues, she had to confer with several senior nuns. And on certain special matters, she had to call the whole community to seek advice and consent. The power was real, but it was framed within consultation and agreement. While everyone obeyed her, she was also responsible to the whole group. She was the head, not a tyrant, and the rules went out of their way to prevent tyranny. The convent's interior was extremely independent, but it was not completely isolated from the grand order of the church. Such a convent was usually supervised by higher authorities and ultimately accountable to a bishop. The bishop had distant authority over the convent, just as the Mother Superior had nearby authority. Her rule inside the walls was absolute, but that rule itself existed within a larger framework to which she owed responsibility. The convent's independence was real, but maintained inside the vast network of the church, not separate from it. Below her, the convent was run by a small group of managers, each with their own duties, working together to keep the place functioning. If the Mother Superior was the general, these were her captains at various levels. There was one guarding the gate, others in charge of the storeroom and kitchen, the clothing and fabrics, the infirmary, the music and books, as well as the bells and small chapel. 6 roles, plus the Mother Superior herself as 7th and head of all. Together, the entire life of the convent, prayer, food, clothing, healing and time, was divided among 7 hands. Each was entrusted with a responsibility and accountable for it, all parts moving together like cogs in a slow-turning machine. As the ancient rule said, the rest of the nuns were the silent soldiers in this army, and the secular sisters were the foot soldiers. The Mother Superior held all the threads in her hands. While she managed everything, another nun guarded the gate, that single threshold connecting this closed world with the outside. As night fell, her task was to close it. She was the gatekeeper nun. Let us call her Petronilla. Her duty was the simplest to describe, yet one of the most sacred and vital. She guarded the gate. She stood on the threshold between the quiet, orderly world within the walls and the vast, noisy, uncertain world outside. Her responsibility was to watch over it, to let in those with rightful cause, those expected, approved, or on official business, and keep others out. During the day, she opened the gate for beggars coming for charity bread, for messengers delivering letters, for drivers bringing goods outside the walls, and for occasional visitors. As darkness closed in, she had to perform the last and most important act of her day. She closed the gate and dropped the latch. Imagine, in the last light, standing with her before that heavy gate, watching her push it shut with effort, then hear the clang as the heavy latch locked into the slot. It was a special sound, the deep thud of wood closing at night. Along with it came a special feeling, a world made whole, safe, and entirely self-sufficient. Outside that gate, the road stretched into darkness, leading to villages, towns, and all the troubles and noise of this age. But inside this gate there was only this quiet convent and the sleeping women, sealed in the night, needing nothing from outside and demanding nothing from the dark. All the long labour done every day to meet the convent's needs was embodied in this small nightly ritual. The gate was shut. The world was left outside. Until dawn, this convent belonged only to itself. At last, the day reached its final office. After evening prayers ended and the light vanished completely, everyone gathered once more in the church for the last assembly before sleep, in that deep silence of night prayers, singing the final prayer of the day. It was short and gentle, a laying down of the day just past, entrusting the coming night to God, praying for protection from the dangers of the dark, and for peaceful rest. When the prayer ended, a great silence fell over the entire convent, the kind of deep quiet where no one spoke in the dead of night. This was the strictest silence of all, night silence. During this time, breaking the silence was forbidden unless in extreme cases. From the end of the last office until the morning bell sounded, the whole convent was wrapped in almost complete stillness. The only sounds were the wind, the creaks of old wood settling, and the distant closing of doors. Conversation for the day, though already sparse, was over. From now until the bell woke them again in the dark, there was nothing but endless silence here. The nuns finally went upstairs, returned to their dormitories, and to those cold beds where they had risen before dawn. They lay down in their undergarments, pulling up covers against the chill. Slowly those small noises ceased one by one. The candles were extinguished. The convent sank into darkness. Somewhere the gatekeeper had dropped the latch, the almoner had finished counting supplies in the storeroom, and the guardian of the sacred vessels was keenly aware of the hour she would have to wake next. The great machine of the day had stopped completely. All tasks laid down, all rooms fallen silent, the copper bell on its frame silent as well. Outside, night cloaked the dark fields, the locked gate, and the sleeping convent inside. Within, the women slept peacefully. They had offered this day, like every day, to the slow cycle of work and prayer. This way of life went on here with a length of time beyond any one woman's memory. In a few hours, in the darkest moment of night, one woman would wake alone, put on her shoes in the dark, go downstairs, and grasp the cold bell rope so this quiet cycle would turn once more. It was not time yet. Now there was only darkness, cold, and the steady, deep breathing of sleeping women, night silently watching over them all. We leave them there in that sleeping monastery and the dark fields around it, quietly returning to where you are, to the warmth where you lie, feeling the soft weight of the covers and the steady peace of your room. Before we leave, stay with these women a little longer. Almost none of them left their names behind. The sacrament guardian nun who kept time in the dark, the head of meals with keys hanging at her waist, the patient hands before the scriptorium and the loom, the nurses tending the sick and the gatekeeping nun dropping the door latch, and the Mother Superior who bore the weight of it all. They lived here, worked here, grew old here, and were eventually forgotten, just like most people who have ever lived on this earth are forgotten. Through their long lives, each held her small but loyal place, day after day. Together they kept a whole world standing and turning. A woman's world, orderly, gentle, calm, and almost entirely their own. There was a quiet dignity in this, one that needed no monuments to remember it. Simply doing the work at hand well was enough. Doing it again tomorrow and the next day until this daily labour itself became a life. Maybe that is the kindest lesson a place like this can offer us, even after centuries have passed and the world outside looks very different today. It is not a grand truth, but a feeling that life does not have to be loud or remembered by the world to be good. In the hours carefully marked, and the tasks done with care before being set down lightly, belonging to something peaceful, steady and larger than oneself, we can all find calm. The women in that monastery found their peace in the flow of ordinary time. On nights like this, lying warmly in the dark, perhaps the same peace can quietly come to your heart. If some piece of their daily lives touched you tonight, maybe a room, a task, or a small kindness held within their rules, you are warmly invited to leave a word below and tell us where in the world you are listening this evening. Reading these messages is always a peaceful pleasure, and they help others discover these stories when they seek a moment of rest. This is a channel telling slow stories from history, only to help you sleep. We want to keep wandering like this, night after night, through quiet corners of long ago, from the Middle Ages to the ancient world, through old houses and old crafts and the everyday lives of people long gone, always at this unhurried pace. If you enjoy more nights like this, please subscribe and join us in watching this story slowly gather, like everything here, bit by bit, calmly growing. There is no rush. Everything can wait until morning. Now, you have nothing left to do and don't need to do anything. You have laid down the burdens of the day. The monastery behind its high walls is already asleep, and there are still several hours before the morning bell tolls. Nothing demands anything of you right now. Let your breath slow down. Let warmth spread all around you. Let quiet gently embrace you, just like the darkness lovingly hugs that old and gentle courtyard in the night. Good night and sweet dreams.